Marisa,
Hi,
hi.
Jessica.
So we first met over 10 years ago when we worked together at Equal Rights Advocates, but I'd
Mhm.
love for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be back in conversation with you. So as you already said, my name is Marisa. I've been an attorney for over about 13 years now, always working in advocating for workers' rights and especially immigrant workers' rights. Done a bunch of different types of legal advocacy and also worked in coalition with many different types of organizers, policy folks, advocates, the broader community. And so, yeah, that's kind of the perspective I'm bringing to our conversation. And what about you? Do you want to say anything more about yourself?
Well, we have kind of similar backgrounds. Before I became a lawyer, I was a paralegal and I worked in a legal services office for migrant farm workers. And that's what kind of motivated me to go to law school. And I've now been a lawyer for a little over 15 years, focused on advocating for workers' rights, representing workers in discrimination cases, and then also doing a lot of legislative advocacy to try to create stronger laws to better protect workers and other people um, and their civil rights. Marisa, how have you been impacted by the Trump administration, both as an attorney, mostly working with immigrant workers, but also as a Latina yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's many facets of how I've been impacted personally and professionally that I'm guessing many folks would resonate with many people, but also be different. On the personal level, of course, I'm a mother. As you mentioned, I'm Latina. I'm a member, immigrants in my family. And of course, I have a very diverse community, close community and broader kind of community where I live that's been impacted in many ways. And so I think part of it has been trying to just really plug into connection on that personal level and how to kind of sustain each other, how to continue to create spaces for joy, spaces for hope, for solidarity, for collective action has been really important in these times. And then on a professional level, of course, I mean, it's all related. The work I do professionally is related to me as a person and the society as well. But I guess I'd say that, I think going into this second Trump administration, those of us who had worked in similar, immigrant workers' rights, for example, in the first administration, were, bracing ourselves for many things we knew that would come. But at the same time, once it actually happened, once they started to be in office, I think it was, just uh, kind of like people say, drinking from a fire hose every day. And so I think it's been a lot of reminding myself and peers that this is a marathon, not a sprint, as many people say, that we have to really focus in on like what is my role here and what's your role and how can we work together and be strategic because there's just too much work for any one person or organization to do. But at the same time, I think, I and many other folks are more committed than ever to the work and it's more needed than ever. And so, yeah, I'd say it's been a journey. I can't believe it's only been a little over a year since the change in administrations. But yeah, I'd say those are kind of some of the highlights or the things that come to mind for me. And what about you? How has this impacted your work, yourself? Yeah.
Well, I think similarly, for those of us who are advocating during the first Trump administration, we saw how much harm occurred in that administration for workers, for communities, really for kind of most people. And so we were kind of expecting a very difficult time during the second administration. But I think most of us were surprised by how much worse it has been during the second administration. I think there was a lot more time for officials in the administration to plan and strategically lay out how they were going to go about really destroying our kind of basic principles and civil rights in America. And they've really gone about that pretty methodically. They kind of had their playbook with Project 2025, and they've been systematically going through that and implementing really harmful changes in kind of almost every aspect of society. And so I think for me, it's been tough. As an advocate, I'm seeing kind of the big headlines that a lot of Americans are seeing about, and the world is seeing about how our kind of basic human rights and civil rights are really being eroded, but also kind of seeing the nitty-gritty of how internal structures within the government are being decimated, and knowing kind of that the impact of those somewhat niche but very critical government agencies on everyday people's lives has been difficult to kind of see every aspect of our government and society being attacked. On the plus side, if there is one, I am heartened by just seeing kind of what you were saying, just seeing people come together and realize like we need to fight this as a group, as a coalition. We can't do this alone. And we kind of remind each other that it might feel overwhelming and hopeless, and it is often very overwhelming, but we do have this really broad community. And that's why I think, seeing people turn out for protests has been really important, to just see the numbers of people that are opposing this administration and the actions they're taking. And then also in the advocacy community, kind of like what you said, we can't take on every fight. And so making sure that we're taking it step by step and working within our capacity and our expertise to try to fight back and protect our communities.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously one of the communities we're seeing most under attack right now is the immigrant community. And you and I both have experience working within the immigrant community and trying to better protect immigrant workers' rights among other workers. How have you seen this situation during this Trump administration as compared to before?
Yeah, similar to what you mentioned earlier in terms of just the speed with which they've been able to kind of like enact some of these anti-immigrant policies and practices has been very, breathtaking and harmful to immigrant workers more broadly. And I think there's two pieces of this. One is also what you mentioned, like kind of the destruction of institutions or shifts in institutions that are meant to protect all workers' rights, including undocumented workers, whatever someone's immigration status, like most laws apply to all workers the same. And so there's been a real kind of gutting of those institutions, and also a shift in how those institutions prioritize what laws they enforce, what laws they don't enforce, which workers they might be open to kind of serving in a way, and which ones now feel at risk to even go to these agencies. So I think there's like the process piece, and then there's also the substantive laws and how those have changed. And so just to give a couple concrete examples on the workers' rights side, the federal agency that enforces anti-discrimination laws in this country, recently put on its website a note about if someone wants to report an employer who hires undocumented workers, they can contact ICE, right? So that's extremely alarming for immigrant workers of many different statuses, of course, including undocumented workers. And that's something that, at least in my time practicing and representing workers, I had never seen. And so there's real risks to workers in asserting their rights, especially to immigrant workers, even more so now than before. But then also there's a whole other immigration side of things, right? That like in people's real lives, all of these come and combine, right? We're complete humans. We can't like divide ourselves up, right? So I think on the immigration side, there's so much. But for purposes of our conversation today, I'll try to highlight just some high level big buckets. I think one, of course, as many people see in the news, see in their communities, there's this mass deportation campaign that the administration has been very explicit about, right? They have arrest quotas. They're engaging in violent, racist, classist raids throughout communities and in workplaces. They're taking away due process, right? Increasing detention. So that's kind of one bucket of what's happening. The other one I would highlight is this mass kind of de-documentation campaign. So what I'm referring to is taking away legal status from people who have it, taking away work authorization from people who have it. So, as of December 2025, within just 11 months of this administration, they had already taken away legal status from, I believe, over 1 million people, right? And that is what people are saying is like the largest de-documentation campaign in history. And so for workers, right, this means people who have been in this country for years and years with work authorization, who are, working with the permission of the government to work in this country, are now having that taken away. And that's a huge impact on them and their families, their communities, and on their employers, of course, right? And then the third bucket I'd highlight is just making it harder for anyone to either enter the country lawfully or for folks who are here to gain some sort of legal status. And so we see things like them increasing fees, them making it riskier to apply, or them like completely pausing applications for a whole category of people. So there's just so many changes, but those are some of the kind of high level ones I would highlight. And I think, for immigrant workers, as an immigrant worker rights advocate, as I mentioned, like these all compound to really mean that it's just that much harder for folks to enforce their rights, to have them respected at work. And it's that much easier for employers who want to use immigration status as a weapon to do so. And so I think this is where you, again, see, organizing a collective action and like connection to resources as so key, in addition to connection to kind of legal resources, but also just more supports in the community. So yeah, there's so much, but that's what I would say. And I'm curious for you, kind of like, what are some big differences, some big changes you have seen in your area of work?
There's so many different challenges right now with regard to immigrant workers' rights and broader groups of worker rights. I think it's so telling that you noted that all of our basic worker rights and employment protection laws apply to all workers. So almost all worker rights laws apply to all workers, regardless of status.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes beyond just a fundamental right for any worker to have basic wage protections, anti-discrimination protections, beyond just the fact that every worker deserves those human rights at work. It's also to protect the broader workforce, because if you have employers emboldened to violate certain groups of people's rights and to know that this undocumented worker won't be able to, go have a claim and get unpaid wages for not getting minimum wage or seek some type of, help and justice for a discriminatory workplace, then that incentivizes employers to hire undocumented workers, and that harms everyone. And so I think the impacts we're seeing go beyond just the immigrant worker community, but also to broader workers who are then harmed as well by these actions. We've seen a lot of important policy responses to these horrific attacks that we're seeing from the federal government on workers that you outlined. And a lot of it's been defensive, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So in the policy advocacy that I work on, at the federal level, it has been trying to fight back against these horrific ICE raids. One kind of big strategy is to try to ensure that ICE and the CBP don't get more funding. They already got a huge amount of funding from a piece of legislation that I know you know about, HR 1, which has really emboldened them and been able to staff up and have just more agents than ever in the streets, kind of terrorizing communities. And so there's been efforts to hold back additional funding until very basic and common sense reforms are agreed to, like not allowing agents to wear masks, requiring them to identify themselves, requiring them to have body cameras. So that's some of the advocacy at the federal level that's ongoing, to try to at least have some accountability measures for these agents and these agencies that are engaging in these tactics. And we've also seen efforts at the state level to better protect immigrants in light of these really scary attacks and raids that we've seen. So last year, for example, here in California, we fought for a law that was passed and took effect this year to have better protection against ICE in schools, and try to address those types of raids in that way. And you talked about how the current federal government's actions are really kind of emboldening some problematic employers to know that immigrant workers may be less likely to assert their rights because of the current climate. So we actually have a bill that we're working on in California right now that would prohibit employers in engaging in kind of coercive tactics to try to prevent workers, immigrant workers in particular, from speaking out about their rights and violations of their rights. So, for example, an employer, casually mentioning that ICE raids are increasing or that ICE could show up, would, of course, create a chilling effect on workers, especially immigrant workers. And so this bill would make that illegal to try to prevent employers from preventing workers, especially immigrant workers, from speaking out about violations of their rights at work. So, while we've seen some just horrific actions from the federal government, we've also seen, and I'm really kind of proud to be part of, state level responses. And like you've been talking about, the community and coalition work that's critical to getting new laws passed it's really heartening to see so many groups and coalitions that may not have been involved in advocating for workers' rights and immigrant workers' rights before coming together to say, no, we need to put a stop to this and put into place protections for immigrant workers, broader workers, and communities as a whole.
Yeah, and I think I've been fortunate to also work in collaboration with folks here in California on that law you mentioned, the coercion law. And I think it's also, as you mentioned, like a good example of the different, the way that we can collaborate with different types of organizations and advocates, right? So folks in the field are the ones, organizers, people out directly talking with workers, right? Who say like, this is a problem, this is happening, there's no protection here, and we think this could be useful. And then the folks who don't have that perspective, but can also be a connector, right? For the part of the policy push. So that's been great to be involved in. And it's hopeful that there are places where we can do these types of kind of more proactive policy pushes.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So at Equal Rights Advocates, we do a lot of different types of policy advocacy, but so often you'll see, a legislator, let's say, or a group pushing a bill that, might sound good in theory, but they haven't actually been talking to the people affected. And so while it might be well-intentioned, it might not get at the issue in the way that really is most meaningful. And so to your point, it's just, I think one of our kind of core principles at ERA and with the partners that we work with and coalitions we work with is listening to the people who are affected by these laws and these challenges on the ground, to really hear from them about what is the policy change that they believe is needed to better protect them and create kind of the change we need in our legal protections. Okay, so what else have you been seeing in terms of other types of attacks on workers' rights from the Trump administration?
Yeah, so I think one thing that comes to mind is kind of the bigger overall narrative that has been pushed by the administration in a way to try to, what I interpret it as is kind of to divide folks, right? To divide workers based on, to scapegoat immigrant communities, immigrant workers, and say like they're the problem, like if and everything would be better if they weren't here, for example. And I think so that I think many people have heard or can read those messages that are coming down from the administration. And so for workers' rights, I think that it's so important to really recognize that solidarity among workers, whether, across lines of immigration status, race, class, industry, right? It's that solidarity is actually part of the solution to better, workplace experiences, to higher workplace standards, and not, dividing and scapegoating certain groups. And one thing that comes to mind is, for example, the affordability crisis that a lot of people are talking about. And, at the same time, the administration is trying to scapegoat certain groups, including immigrant workers, for part of the affordability crisis. They're also pushing policies that actually make that worse for working people. So when we think about what we can afford, it's not just the cost of something, it's also the wages we earn to pay for that cost, right? And so the administration is doing things to actively, right, reduce wages for workers. There are states that have passed laws that make it impossible for, cities and counties that want to raise wages, right, to be able to do that, for example. So I think we really need to to point that out, right? And to remember that like dividing amongst ourselves is not going to help anyone. We really need to be in solidarity. And that's what's going to help, improve workplace standards for everyone. Some more, maybe a more specific example too that I think that I've noticed too under this administration that's very much related to kind of the immigration side of things is so for those of us in the advocacy community, I'm going to try to, talk about this in a more understandable way. But there are programs that are known as guest worker programs, for example, where people can come from other countries and have a temporary visa to work here for a specific employer. That's been the case for a long time now. But those programs are already, unfortunately, just create the conditions for exploitation because people are tied to their employers, right? They can't just leave an abusive employer and go work for someone else. They would then lose their status and have to go back to their country and maybe be blacklisted from ever coming back again through those programs. So there's already a lot of amazing organizations, other, advocates working on improving those programs to protect workers' rights, which is very necessary. But what's happening under this administration is they're kind of proposing that we need to expand these programs as a solution to our mass deportation of other workers who are here, right? And so that's another example of kind of pitting different groups of workers against each other, but also an example of like really eroding workplace rights for everyone, right? Like that is not the solution. The solution is to raise standards for everyone, to raise wages, to attract more workers for folks who are already here, to create pathways to status for workers who are here, and also to improve these programs for the people who are in them to protect their rights. So I think that's just, I think overall, I would say that kind of like, let's divide and to the benefit of course, corporate interest. So for us as advocates, I think it's kind of pushing back against that and recognizing strategically how to do that in the long term. And what about you? Are there any kind of like higher level overall workers' rights or other kind of policy things that you're seeing come down?
Yeah, you talked about this a little bit. I think one of the many concerning changes that we're seeing is that the very agencies of the federal government that are tasked with protecting workers are now literally doing the opposite, refusing to enforce the basic protections and laws that they're supposed to be enforcing for certain workers. Specifically, you mentioned the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the EEOC, which their stated mission and directive, the reason that agency was created was and is to protect workers and enforce anti-discrimination law. And that agency, the president, fired illegally 2 commissioners from that commission. And under the current chair that he put into place, she has directly stated that they will not enforce anti-discrimination law for certain people, namely transgender people and other members of the LGBTQ community, which is, of course, directly contrary to what that agency and that commission's work is to do. And so, for many workers, they can't afford to get a lawyer and go to court. And so going to the EEOC is a way that low-wage workers who can't afford to get a lawyer are able to seek some type of justice for workplace rights violations. If they're experiencing discrimination based on being a woman or being a Latina or being someone who's older, that going to the agency is a way to, you don't need a lawyer. They will do an investigation and they can sometimes even do a mediation and help the worker achieve some kind of settlement instead of having to go to court. And so when this route is closed off to certain workers, that essentially means that even though they, in theory, have those legal protections, they have no ways to enforce them. And so they're pretty meaningless. The administration has also severely cut funding to that and other agencies, which means that they were already completely strapped, receiving more complaints from workers than they could actually investigate and handle. And now they have even fewer resources. And so we're seeing the closures of offices where workers go. And so especially in more rural areas, it's really essentially impossible for a lot of workers to seek any form of justice when their rights have been violated. And so I think kind of we're seeing kind of a two-pronged approach. This administration is decimating the actual rights and protections that exist, and then also eliminating any path to justice that workers might have to try to seek some kind of justice for violations of their rights. Just one other kind of example in that vein is there's kind of a part of the workforce that a lot of people don't know about, or at least aren't aware of it as being a group, which is federal contractors. And so these are companies that have contracts with the government, and they do business with the government. And they, while they're not necessarily known to a lot of Americans, they employ millions and millions of Americans. And so for 60 plus years, we've had protections in place for the workers, for the employees of those federal contractors that go beyond our basic anti-discrimination laws that apply to all workers. And the idea was that if you are a business that has the privilege of doing business with the federal government, then we're going to hold you to an even higher standard and require you to do more to protect your workers against discrimination and to ensure equal employment opportunities so more workers from underrepresented groups can get these jobs. The Trump administration eliminated those protections, and essentially the agency that was charged with protecting those workers is severely reduced. It's called the OFCCP. So it's just another example of where we're seeing the Trump administration just completely take steps to completely go against what these agencies' missions are to protect workers, and it's just part of a broader pattern of trying to harm average working Americans in this country. So, Marisa, what other solutions do you think advocates should be pursuing right now?
Yeah, I would say, well, I think it's got to be very localized, right? I think what people are experiencing is very dependent on where in the country they live, what the politics are in their city, in their county, in their state, and also obviously the federal government. So I think that really it requires this moment, but always, I think the best practice, right, is to really work in collaboration and collectively with different types of, I say organizers, advocates, organizers, policy advocates, lawyers, directly impacted communities, right? Really centering like what are the problems on the ground? What are the solutions that folks who are impacted by those problems think should be pursued? And then working in coalition to try to pursue that in the most strategic way based on your reality wherever you are in the country. And so I think as lawyers, I think it's really important for us to remember that the courts, the legislative bodies, the government is often not the solution or not the only solution. It's part of a broader effort, right, to improve, to protect our rights, to improve our workplace conditions. But we have to think more broadly, and we have to, follow the lead of other people in our communities, other types of advocates as well, and to support kind of the broader movement. So I think of this, folks who are in red states, where, for example, what I mentioned, there are state laws that say, like, even a city that wants to, for example, pass a protection about heat. Something we see a lot right now is a lot of workers are impacted by heat at the workplace, whether they work outside or inside. And that's extremely dangerous. And the folks who are most in danger are those who are working in underpaid industries. So, for example, a lot of, there are amazing organizations on the ground who are figuring out ways to say, okay, well, we can't rely on our state government. We tried our local government. The federal government right now is doing everything we just mentioned. So what are ways that we can be creative here to organize and to put pressure in a different way to achieve what we want? So I think that I don't have the answer to what should the solution be. I think my answer is the solution needs to be grounded in community and be strategic based on kind of what the goal is and what the kind of political and legal reality and, lived experiences in those communities. Yeah. And what about you? What are some solutions or ideas you have for how folks can be trying to kind of address what's happening?
I think you kind of alluded to this in thinking about how we can think of really creative and important solutions to this real crisis, it's important to remember that even before this Trump administration, the prior Trump administration, a lot of these systems were not working for a lot of people. And there were a lot of challenges for immigrants, low wage workers, families just trying to get by, even before the current administration. And so, having this kind of essentially near destruction of a lot of the basic systems that are in place in our country, gives us an opportunity to not only fight back and try to build back protections for workers, for communities, but to try to reimagine how these systems could be even better than they were. And I think I'm really heartened by the fact that the advocacy communities that I'm advocating in, that I know that you're in, and the coalitions that we're working with are, yes, engaged in kind of a two-pronged fight. Fighting back against the current day-to-day attacks from the federal government and trying to protect our workers and our communities as best we can, but also thinking ahead to the future about how we can create systems that better serve workers and communities even better than they had been before. I think that's an important it's an important kind of strategy to keep in mind, because the reference you made earlier, and people make it a lot, but it's very apt, is that under the current administration, it really is like drinking from a fire hose. And so when you're in constant defense mode and constantly trying to respond to a million different attacks from every angle of this administration, people are exhausted. Both the communities that are most affected, of course, most exhausted and most harmed. And then the advocates who are trying to fight back are exhausted. So really trying to kind of be conscious about making space to think about strategies to make the world even better when we get through this administration. I think it's an important thing to remember. So I've been trying to kind of set aside that time in the coalitions that I'm a part of to really think about how we want to kind of strengthen and recreate laws that are even better for our communities. So we've talked a lot about some really scary attacks that we're seeing from the federal government and detrimental impacts on communities. What is giving you hope at this time?
That's a good question. I guess one of the themes of what I've said today, I'm going to go back to, is just kind of one of the things that's giving me hope is just staying local, I think, and learning from other communities of what they're doing at the local level. So on a personal, the personal side, for example, like really plugging in, for example, to the school community in my child's school, right? And like leaning on each other, supporting each other, seeing how people are coming together and organizing. And I think just looking towards like, we need to help each other, right? Like there's all these things happening on these other levels, but like this is where we live. This is where our children go to school and play, and this is our community. So that's really giving me hope, is just seeing on a local level, like all of the amazing work folks are doing to support each other and to build systems that, as you mentioned, like work better for people, whether now or in the future. And then also, I think one thing I've loved about the work I've been able to do, in my professional life over this the last year or so, right, is really bringing together people, worker organizers from different places in the country to talk to each other about what they're doing at the local level and to share, of course, really hard things, but also hopeful things. So in some of the communities that we've seen most, in the headlines and under attack, like folks in Minneapolis and Chicago, in LA, in different places that have experienced like just the extreme levels of terror, right, against immigrant communities and broader communities of color, come together and share, of course, really hard things, but also hopeful things about what they have seen in their communities, what they have been doing, and what people could learn and for other communities. So I think that solidarity and that kind of local level support and organizing is definitely giving me hope. And what about you? What is something that's giving you hope?
I think because my work is focused on policy advocacy and trying to change laws and strengthen laws, a lot of the hope I'm getting is from the coalitions that we work with. to make those changes or try to make those changes in the law. Here in California, we lead a coalition called Stronger California, and it brings together over 70 organizations from all around the state. And these are groups that work in kind of seemingly different areas, childcare advocacy, anti-poverty work, workplace rights, and reproductive health and reproductive rights. But we as a Stronger California coalition have really kind of come together to see how all of our issues intersect, and all of our communities that we advocate for face challenges in these different areas. And so it's always been kind of our ethos to take a really comprehensive approach to looking at how the support that women and communities need to live economically secure lives and thrive. And especially since this administration took over and we're seeing women and communities under even more attack than they already were, I've really gotten a lot of hope from seeing how that Stronger California coalition, as well as our other coalition partners, have come together and banded together to not only move pieces of legislation that help defend against these federal attacks and better protect communities. So, for example, passing laws that protect trans healthcare patients and to ensure their data is not publicly available and is kept private, so that out-of-state actors or even in-state actors that would seek to do harm with that data are not able to access it. Or, ensuring we have adequate access to reproductive health care, birth control, and other abortion-related health care, given the rollbacks at the federal level. So seeing kind of both those types of defensive policy initiatives really being moved forward by these coalitions, but also not giving up on a kind of positive, proactive vision of the future. And so while we as coalitions are fighting back and passing these new laws to better protect against the federal attacks, we're also still moving really bold pieces of legislation that seek to strengthen our laws, and essentially not letting the Trump administration and the kind of federal nightmare that we're all living dictate the work that we do. So, just last year, we passed a really comprehensive new equal pay law that ensures our equal pay laws are inclusive of people of all genders. And it ensures that workers who have experienced pay discrimination can recover more of the wages that they were unlawfully denied. And so I think, again, the hope I'm getting is that we have these groups and coalitions coming together and recognizing we're going to protect ourselves, protect our communities, protect the most vulnerable who are under attack, but also continue to try to move really good, proactive policy reform forward, so that we can keep the ball moving, and keep our state at the forefront of leading kind of policy change, cutting edge policy change. But hopefully that will help other states kind of follow suit and enact some similar reforms to better protect people and communities in those other areas as well. And eventually, that kind of state level policy change, I think, will create the momentum at the federal level to move federal policy change so that everyone is protected. And it doesn't matter what your zip code is. Your rights will not depend on where you live, but rather everyone in the country will have kind of the basic workers' rights and human rights that we all deserve. So we've talked a lot about just some very real challenges and harms that we are seeing as advocates, that our communities are experiencing. What is your vision of a thriving country looking forward?
That's a great question. I think, I'm going to just let myself dream for a second. So as a workers' rights advocate, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just that in our current reality, right, for so many people, just to live is working multiple jobs in, not ideal conditions, sometimes really terrible conditions, right, just to survive, right? So in an ideal, thriving world, I think that wouldn't be the case, right? One job would be enough and we could thrive in that job, not just survive. Or maybe we don't even need to work in the same way, but that's kind of where my mind first goes. And I think it'd be a world where, everyone is treated with dignity at work and outside of work, regardless of immigration status, regardless all the different ways, systems of oppression come into our lives on an individual level. I think that it would also be a world where we would really have, I think, again, something I've talked about a lot is just this collective action and how important that is. And I think ideally we would have a government, a system that really is responsive to the community's needs, to our needs, and is designed by the community, right? Where our voice is really listened to and we really have influence over how these institutions work, how they serve us, and just the ability to kind of really, I think, live more authentically in community with each other in a way that supports all of us. So those are just some things that come to mind when I let myself kind of dream in that way. But yeah, I don't know. What about for you? What do you think this other world could look like?
I like the idea of dreaming big. I think, again, focus on kind of our area of advocacy of workers' rights. I think for me, a thriving country is one in which a worker can survive and support themselves and their families working just one job, and without having to worry about putting food on the table, despite working in that job. It's a world in which a worker has access to, and all workers have access to, adequate paid family leave so that they don't need to make a choice between their own health or the health of a family member or a child and their job. It's a world in which workers don't have to put up with really discriminatory and often kind of scary harassment at work. We, in the kind of gender justice realm, just continue to see women and people across genders experiencing just horrific levels of harassment in the workplace. Definitely, sexual harassment and harassment based on sex and gender, but also race-based harassment, national origin-based harassment. And so kind of a country that's thriving for me is one in which workers do not experience that type of discrimination and harassment in the workplace. And if they do, they have an agency that actually is working for them and supporting them in seeking justice. I feel heartened being able to work with advocates like you and like the different advocates within the coalitions that we've talked about that we work with, because I think we all have that shared vision that we've talked about of looking for policy changes that help us create kind of not just a world in which workers are getting by, but in which workers and families are thriving. And to do that, it really will require what you said, kind of listening to the people most impacted because they know what policy solutions are most needed based on their own lived experience. And too often they're kind of shut out of the decision-making circles in many aspects, but specific to policy, often the most impacted people are not at the tables deciding what new laws are passed. And so as we create that, beautiful new future, I think that is a shared goal of bringing the people most impacted, the communities most impacted to the table to hear from them about what solutions they need and then working with them to implement those new solutions.
Mm-hmm. It's been great chatting with you again, Jessica, and just, looking forward to continue to work in coalition with you and many others as we try to build this different future.
Me too. We talked about how the fire hose effect, and, we're just every day trying to fight back against these attacks. So it's actually just really nice to have a space to talk about kind of where we imagine this work going and being in it together. So I appreciate you.
Yeah.
For all of us.